In the BattleTech universe, there is no noble house grander, greater, and more important than the family of Cameron. But which ruler of House Cameron was indeed the best? Well, friends, I guess it's time for rating. The BattleTech universe is so far quite interesting because, like other science fiction franchises from the 80s, you can see the great shift. Science fiction before that was usually very optimistic, the way into a bright new future. Think about Star Trek and so. But the 80s came around and the perspective of the population shifted, and a new kind of science fiction rose. Think about Blade Runner, think about Warhammer 40k, which, by the way, was heavily influenced by BattleTech. And yes, think also about Cyberpunk and BattleTech. And they have in common that they are much more grittier, all the way to grimdark. And as such, they do not view the future as something incredibly hopeful. In BattleTech, this new approach is handled by introducing the first Star League. It is the golden age that the old science fiction promised. A new and shiny world where technology is in fact magic and where everything can happen. A happy and golden time. And then this golden age is ended. And we get the Succession Wars, which were the original BattleTech setting. It is the mission of House Cameron to represent this golden age. Please keep in mind that they were born dead. The original setting is usually around the year 3025, and the House of Cameron was more than 200 years gone by that point. They were always part of the background noise, the backstory, and therefore details are a bit lacking. If you followed my extensive video about House of Cameron, you probably are well aware about the shenanigans they all commenced. If not, I would implore you to give this video a look because it's quite interesting and it gives you an important background of the BattleTech universe. But now let us go to the ranking. Of course, we have with the House of Cameron a little problem. The first man we have to mention is not a Cameron at all. Admiral and Director General James McKenna. We cannot really ignore him. I decided to sidestep the issue a bit by using him as the benchmark, the great guy that all the others have to surpass to really become a legend. And I will also use him to explain my highly objective and scientific rating system. About who would be qualified to be rated, I decided to go with the head of House Cameron. That means they must be Camerons, except, of course, James McKenna, and they must have a position of power. So someone who never became either Director General or First Lord is out. All those who only were Director General after the Star League were made and basically followed their fathers are also out. I will not rate those who have the position of Director General or First Lord as an regent or in the interim. So both Amaris and Kerensky will not be judged here. I have plenty of judgment for them elsewhere. And also, I will not give Jocasta a rating. Although, of course, she will be mentioned when we tackle her brother. So, let's get to it. Of course, the first man, as mentioned, is James McKenna. He pretty much is the Julius Caesar to the Cameron Empire. The man who set it all up and became before, but was not able to establish his own dynasty. He is a very important man in the history of BattleTech. He is, after all, the father of warships and the Blackwater Navy, Dreadnought class, and so on. And For us, even more important, he is the man who created the Terran Hegemony in the first place. Remember, I talked about in the Cameron video and also the Warship video. He was the man who, after the Zoli affair, twisted the arms of the parties on Terra to accept a new system with him as Director General. How would I rank him? The first metric I use is power. I do not differentiate between economical, diplomatic, or military power. Power is for me the ability to make things happen, to enforce your own will onto the inner sphere. And James McKenna, he clearly has a high rating. I used the same variations I already utilized in the Primus of Comstar video. That, as you can recall, a 1 means that they're diminished their potential and their capabilities. A 2 means a slight diminishing. 3 means they went okay and had no big changes. 4 means an increase, and 5 means a massive increase. Here, for example, I gave Mr. McKenna, or more specifically Admiral McKenna, a power rating of 5. He took a shattered and unimportant state that had abandoned most of its colonies and was, in effect, reduced to the planet of Terra itself, and turned it into the most productive and powerful of the post-collapse states. That's a massive increase. He built a navy, he went on his campaigns of persuasion, which were quite ruthless conquests, and he established a formidable entity. So power for him is obviously a 5. Massive increase. The next thing we have to judge is stability. Stability is different from power. It means how ordered were the effects, how ordered was your state. Was there any danger rising, or could you somehow relax? Think about it that way. A high stability makes the need for high power obsolete. It is what gives you smooth sailings and a relaxing rule. And here again we have a massive increase. When he started his takeover, Terra itself was in civil war. People were dying on the streets. Everything was close to collapse. The economy was going down, mass uprisings. The former colonies were all doing more or less their own thing. It was complete anarchy. And he took over, established a functioning system that worked for centuries after him. And he ended the civil war and started to refocus the energies of Terra itself onto a new task. Again, stability, just like power, has to be a massive increase, 5 points here. The next thing I will judge here is tech. The Terran Hegemony, and far more even the First Star League, were golden ages because they pushed technology and science to new heights and more audacious extremes. And so I think it's important to also judge our rulers how they husbanded their technological progress. What did they do to make science more powerful? Here I cannot give him a 5. Although, I have to point out, he is, after all, the father of warships, so he did push progress quite a bit. I decided that I can honor him at best with a 4. It was not as great and grand and outstanding like some others, but it was also quite substantial. So 4 it is. Talking about the Golden Age, another component of the First Star League was also the extreme prosperity it had for its citizens, especially those on Terra and the neighboring systems. We do not get so much about Admiral McKenna and his economic policies in this regard. We know that Terra itself was quite wealthy before, and it continued to be wealthy afterwards. But he was not really a man who would go out for trade negotiations. He was too busy to expand the borders of hegemony and to subdue the threats and enemies in the near vicinity. So I decided to give him a free. He didn't damage anything, but he was also a man with priorities elsewhere. Now, we come to the last metric. The House of Cameron, even far more than Mr. McKenna, was always big of morality. And if you look into the self-styling, the ideas and the propaganda of those institutions that claim a heritage of the First Star League, like the clans or mercenary outfits like the Highlanders and the Eridani Light Horse, they usually do this by claiming the moral high ground. They paint a picture of a super good and bright state that could do no wrong and always cared about doing the right thing and being moral and good. And so I think it's only fair for us as objective and fair judges to also look into the morality and the moral behavior of those rulers we have to judge. And here I decided that James McKenna was not really a paragon of virtue. I gave him a rating of 2. He was not a catastrophe and he had some redeeming qualities, but at the end of the day, he destroyed democracy and established a dictatorship. That's not exactly something we would call moral or good. And he was also audacious enough to use his son as an admiral during the disaster of the Smyrna campaign, which caused the death of thousands of soldiers. And after that, he was good enough to remove his son from office, but he also used his influence to protect him. I cannot really say that that was a very moral or virtuous behavior after all, but as I said, I cannot also condemn him because there were redeeming factors. So, morality, it is a 2. I also wanted to inform you that I allowed myself to add another ranking, something that will not judge how good someone was or how successful, but to tell us, as the viewers, listeners, and readers, how important the ruler was for the overall story of the innersphere. Here I say we have to give James McKenna a ranking of 5. He is an extremely important character for the history of the innersphere, and both the creation of the Terran Hegemony and the development of warships would shape history for almost a millennia to come. It can only be 5 points for importance. With Admiral James McKenna gone, we can finally go to the proper Camerons. And of course, we'll start with Michael Cameron, the first ruler of this house. You recall that he actually got the position because he was able to win an election. So you see, at that time there were at least some democratic elements still in use if it came to the Terran Hegemony. He was far less warlike than Admiral McKenna and primarily became known as an organizer, the man that truly created the structures of the Terran Hegemony. The first important step that he did is also quite controversial. It was Michael Cameron who reintroduced the ancient concept of an aristocracy to the Terran Hegemony. At his time, it was basically just an honor you can bestow upon some worthy individual, but it also had the element to become, again, a self-replicating system. The other action he undertook was the creation of HRAD. So he was the first who truly pushed technology as a means to increase the power of the hegemony, a policy that many of his followers and successors, especially the successful and good ones, would also maintain. Let's go to the ranking. If we come to power, we have to admit that Admiral McKenna already increased it so much that there was little need for Michael Cameron to add to it. I would say that the power of him was about equal to his predecessor, and so he gets a maintaining 3. But on the other side, he was able to increase the stability of a realm. His idea to introduce an aristocracy created the glue that bound his state a bit tighter together. And also his technological endeavors gave him a boon he could use to increase loyalty of his subjects. I think a 4 is in order. Of course, he also gets a nice rating for tech. Here I also went with a 4. He was the man behind HRAD, and like so often, the man who plants a tree will not sit in his shade. He started a policy, but he was not yet able to truly harvest all the fruits it would give to the following generations. Therefore, I kind of scaled down the rating. But on the other side, his focus on internal policies also allowed him to increase the prosperity of his state. So here again, he gets a 4. If it comes to morality, I'm quite mixed. His action to create a new nobility was not bad, but it would have unpleasant and anti-democratic consequences later on. At the end, I decided to play it safe and give him a 3. He was not the most moral individual, but he was no scoundrel either. I think it's fair. If we come to the importance, he of course is still a very important individual, but less so than James McKenna. So I gave him a 4. But what will be with his daughter, who became the next Director General? Margaret Cameron stayed quite close to the ideas and policies of her father. She increased the focus on technology by instituting the Mother Doctrine that put some restrictions on the sharing and the dissemination of technologies to other states. She also was an avid supporter of the Second Amendment, an ancient American law, and distributed weapons to essentially all citizens. If that's a good trade or a bad trade, I'll leave for you to decide. But if we judge her performance, we have to recognize that she was able to increase the power of the Terran Hegemony. She was more willing to go out to other states and to start diplomatic interactions with them. A clear improvement over her father. A 4 was deemed by me to be sufficient. Regarding both stability and tech, she essentially continued the status quo. Big impulses to change something here were not her forte, so a 3 for both stability and tech is my verdict. But the good thing is, she continued to increase the prosperity of the realm. So here again, a 4 seems to be fine. About morality, we have a problem that there are not many actions and events we can truly pinpoint to her. Things went along like before, and she neither conducted acts of glorious heroism, nor was she a vile fiend. So 3 it again is. If it comes to importance, she was a bit less important than her father. The Mother Doctrine was still an important step for the history of the innersphere, but it is the only thing that truly really matters from her reign, so I decided that a 3 should be okay. But now we come to the third Cameron on the throne, Raymond Cameron, a man who was crippled by his injuries, who therefore became an autocrat and was blighted with a cheating wife. A man who was quite bitter, maybe because the injuries also made him infertile, and he was, if we follow the sources, not exactly a pleasant man to be around. He did nothing to diminish the power of the Terran hegemony. Look closely, we'll see that he did very much to maintain it, but he was not long enough in office to truly increase it, or, on the other side, to fail with his policies, so he gets a free. But sadly, his rude methods and his paranoia also were a detriment for the stability of a Terran hegemony. There were conflicts. He used intimidation to bring planets into compliance. Not a good thing. And he also did nothing to improve the growth of tech. There were very little discoveries made during his reign. So I decided that stability and tech both have to get a 2 rating. He did not cause major or terrible damage, but he also failed to maintain the high standard that his grandfather and mother established. At least he was able to maintain the general prosperity of his realm. If it comes to morality, I think we have to give him a 2. He was, altogether, not a very moral man. You may have some empathy with him because cheating spouses are not a nice thing to have, but I don't think that we have to judge a ruler by their family matters. At least not so much. And the thing that he was willing to twist and brutalize his own subjects and refuse to listen to advice made him, at the end, unpleasant character. That he, at the end, even was close to damaging the House of Cameron's standing in the Terran hegemony by starting a trial against his brother, also did not really help. I have to give him a 2 for morality. And sadly, because he did nothing of really lasting importance and was comparable fast gone, he is a quite forgettable Director General. Or, let us say it so, he is unimportant. A footnote of history, and he gets a 1. In a strange twist of fate, the man who cheated on him became the next Director General, Brian Cameron. At least he had the decency, after the medical death of his brother, to honor his lover and make her his wife, and to adopt his biological son. So, at least some redeeming qualities in this regard. He was also the man who gave Castles Bryan the name. You remember those fortresses that the Terran hegemony and far bigger scale, the First Star League, always built to garrison planets and space lanes. He was the man who started the concept. So that's something for him. He was also so far wise because he was wary about the actions of the Combine. That speaks at least for his brain. For me, he gets 3 for power. He was not yet able to truly shift the favor towards the Terran hegemony, but he did nothing wrong either. So, after our system, 3 it is. The same is also true for stability. The problematic situation around the death of his brother and his family matters were diminishing towards his standing in the state. But unlike his brother, he was not willing to alienate the advisors and other politicians. So I think a 3 is, again, in order. He also did nothing really to push technology, although he did nothing to hinder it either. A 3 it is, and the same goes for prosperity. Although he was a cheat, I also give him a bit higher rating for morality, because as I said, even if we don't like it, we have to judge rulers and their morality different to ordinary folks. So he gets a 3. But again, besides developing the concept of a castle brine, he was really not that influential overall. In fact, the most interesting stories about him are the cheating on his brother and that he was killed by an enraged bull and later paid compensation before dying to the farmer because he lost his main stream of revenue. An interesting story, but unimportant. So, besides the wife, he also shares the importance rating with his brother and gets a 1. But you know what? We're right into the Cameron siblings, and they both had a sister, Judith Cameron. First, I have to say one thing. We all know the picture of her, and yes, I also think that this dress and this jewelry is extremely tacky, even for 1980s standards. But this is not about fashion, this is about rulers of the House of Cameron, and I must say this lady was good. She was the one that truly made the Castle Brine a staple of defensive architecture, and not only built more of them towards the border of the Draconis Combine, but also fortified the border to the Three Worlds League and the Campanian Confederation. She also started diplomatic overtures towards the Lion Commonwealth and the Federated Sons to both secure the military frontier and to increase economic cooperation, which is pretty good. During her tenure, sadly, the Age of War finally started, and warfare became a common staple among politics in the inner sphere. It was not her fault, but it also increased her importance for the overall history. And one thing we should not forget, the Amaris Conventions were invented by Alicia Liao, but it was the unwavering support of Judith Cameron that made them the important part of legislation that they are in the current timeline. Without Judith Cameron, the Amaris Conventions were just a thought. How will we rank this powerful lady? I think she was the first since her mother to increase the power potential of the hegemony. She did so by some military buildup, some new technology, but mostly by her diplomatic endeavors. Did she turn the hegemony into a superpower that could shape the inner sphere completely? No, that would be too much. But she truly improved the situation, so I think a 4 would be good. Stability-wise, she maintained the status quo, and if you want to be a bit insulting, she was the chairwarmer for her nephew, who would follow her in office. We already established that if you keep the status quo, you get a secure 3, which is fine. But it was also Judith Cameron that finally the mother doctrine started to bring in dividends. She was ruler during a boom in technological innovations, especially towards the navy and the military technologies. So she gets a 4. Prosperity-wise, she was a bit hampered by the beginning of the Age of War. Money that she could have used under other circumstances to improve the likelihood and the living standards of the people had to go to the military. So, sadly, we can only give her a 3. But, I have to point out, she always tried to do the right thing, and she threw herself behind the Amaris Conventions. Something she was not forced to do, but she did so willingly. It was a moral act, an act that was intended to reduce suffering, and this has to be honored by giving her a 4 for morality. I also do not know of any vile or evil acts she conducted, so I think it's a fair verdict. Overall, she was, among her siblings, by far the most important. She was ruler at a critical point in time, she took the right actions, and she managed to write her name in the right history books. So she gets a 4 in importance. But no, let's continue to the next generation. Richard Cameron III. It was quite interesting. You remember he was the legitimized biological son of Brian Cameron, but in many ways he was closer to his uncle. He was also an autocrat who deeply favored the aristocracy. And he also preferred military rule over administrative reform. The hegemony took a more authoritarian turn during his tenure. It was also Richard Cameron who conducted the Centaurus campaign against the Federated Suns, which was a major military victory. Since this campaign necessitated a military build-up, and he conducted this action quite well, he gets a 4 if it comes to the power metric. On the other side, he did very little to truly reform the Terran hegemony in the inside, and he also showed very little interest for technology besides maintaining the current situation. So he gets a 3 in both. Sadly, during his time, there was also a decline in prosperity. Not necessarily his fault. I mean, we had the Age of War, but I have to give him a 2 here. And the fact that he deeply and severely diminished the democratic participation and the civil liberties in the Terran hegemony has some effects on his morality rating. He was also a quite ruthless warmonger, so I cannot, with a good conscience, give him a positive rating. I decided to give him a 2. Overall, there was little truly important and groundbreaking happening during his time, so he again is one of the lesser important Camerons. He gets a 1. It's the complete opposite to his son. Hey, do you hear something? Oh, something really big is coming. Wow, Jacob Cameron. Look at the man, I mean, just look at him. The glasses, the mullet, the mustache. Wow, what a man. And he was arrogant and selfish, but you just want to follow him into the thick of it. And by the way, he was also the man behind the invention of the battle mech. That's alone a very important thing. I mean, without him, there would be no game of Stompy Robots. He was also the one responsible to send a special agent named Amaris into the Rimworld's Republic. And this special agent would become the matriarch of a new dynasty that would rule this periphery nation. I think I heard the name Amaris somewhere else. Yeah. But I think it's an important thing that we have to take note of. By the way, Jacob Cameron was also the father of the battle mech. Yeah? The mech was created under his tutelage, and that's something we have to keep in mind that's really important here. At the end, he was a selfish and arrogant man who was often brash and was not afraid to push military action, but he was also total vaporweight. Man, look at the man, he is cool. That's more important than most other things. Plus, I don't know if I've already mentioned it, he was the one who created the battle mech. That's awesome. As a result, if it comes to power, I have to give him a 5-point rating. He truly changed the power dynamics of innersphere. Sadly, that was also quite expensive. Battle mechs do not grow on trees, and he had to use extensive funding to make them happen. First as a prototype, and then as a mass-produced military asset. This was a strain on the stability of the Terran hegemony. So even if I would give him a 5 rating if I can, I have to accept that here only a 2 is acceptable. He did diminish the stability. But on the other side, if it comes to technology, he has to get a 5-point rating, simply because he was the man who created the battle mech, and 5 points should be well deserved. But on the other side, he was really in the middle of the age of war, and the fighting was the worst, and his projects chewed through the treasury and the economic growth potential like nothing else. In fact, he put the economic stability of the realm into jeopardy. It has to be a 1. The economic situation under his reign was not a good one. It was probably the worst for a long, long time. If it comes to morality, we have to admit that he is a man who would forgive everything. But if we go closer, we have to say that he had a bad reputation, but he was not necessarily evil in itself. Difficult personality, maybe, but not a villain. I think that he was, after all, pretty standard, so morality is a 3. Of course, without saying, his importance for the setting and the innersphere and the universe is a 5. Nothing else will do. He was followed by Theodore Cameron, a man who was a little bit less arrogant, but far more selfish. He built palaces for himself everywhere. He demolished the Alamo because he wanted a ranch retreat. He was absolutely addicted to luxuries. He was not a complete waste of space, because after all, he was also interested in the navy and the military, and achieved a magnificent victory over the Free Worlds League at Oriente. But the thing he is most known for is that he just loved to party. And in fact, it was partying too hard that led to his death. Remember, children, pneumonia is nothing to laugh about. It's a serious disease, and it still kills a lot of people, even in our modern medical scientific society. If we have to judge him, I would say that he took the military build-up of his father and ran with it. There were not that many new ideas or creations, so a 3 should be okay. Sadly, his hunger for luxuries also put a strain on the society as a whole. Remember, his shenanigans at the Alamo led to mass protests and almost uprisings. That's not a good development. He has to get a 2 here for jeopardizing the stability of his realm. If it comes to technology, he was not as bash and bold as his father, but still continued to business as usual. A 3 is what we have to give him. Prosperity continued to decline under his leadership. He was too busy to indulge himself, so he gets a 2. And after all, I also have to give him a 2 if it comes to morality. He was not actively evil or tyrant. He just was greedy and selfish and basically wrong in his position. So 2 it is. And after all, his lack of true actions and lack of vision forces us to give him a 1 rating if it comes to importance. We could remove this chapter from history books and nothing would really change. And the thing is quite similar to his daughter, Elizabeth Cameron. She was also quite fond of partying and luxuries, a true eye candy after all accounts. And the interesting thing is that she had a hands-off approach if it comes to politics and administration. Basically, she allowed the administration to run on autopilot.
If her signature was needed, she just signed the documents. If a decision was to be made, she followed the advice. That's basically how monarchies in the late 20th century worked, and it is not the worst approach to the office, but in a world where it's important to have dedicated and distinct leadership, it's not good. The positive trait about her is that she supported technological growth far more than her father. In fact, quite a few interesting developments were made during her reign, mostly in the realm of aerospace assets. If we judge her, we will see that she is a bit better than her father, but quite close to him. She did nothing to diminish, but nothing to improve the power of hegemony. Thanks to her hands-off administration, the stability of the realm continued to decline. People started to ask themselves, do we really need the Camerons? Not a good thing. Her interest and support for technology and science improved the situation quite a bit, so here she gets a 4. If it comes to prosperity and morality, she was also quite ordinary. The situation improved a bit because she was less spending than her father, and the age of war was winding down a bit, so she gets a 3 when it comes to prosperity. And if we have to judge her character, she cannot be blamed that she was evil or cruel or a tyrant. She was barely even there. So a 3 makes the most sense. Sadly, after all, she is about as important as her father. That means not important at all. History books don't need a chapter about her, and so she gets a 1 if it comes to importance. But now we get into an interesting episode. We have Deborah Cameron, a mother of a certain Ian, who will later appear. She was remarkable because she was again a very active and very driven politician. She pushed the Terran Hegemony in a new direction. Her idea was the aggressive peacemaking campaign that put a focus on reducing conflicts, improving cooperation, and diplomatic efforts. Besides that, which is less often reported, she also started a massive build-up of the intelligence agencies and the information network. She was also not afraid to take the money bookmarked for pleasures and palaces and put it into civilian research to not only improve the living standard of her people, but to have additional leverage during diplomatic negotiations. And the most interesting thing is, she was remarkably tolerant towards dissenters. Most of the Camerons before her and after her were not very patient when it came to the opposition, but she encouraged it and was not afraid to went into dialogue with them. That's remarkable. Overall, I would say that she led a change of a power that the hegemony had at their disposal. So I give her, even if she did a lot, still a 3. What she really improved by a tremendous amount was the internal cohesion and stability of the realm. The people who before her reign had questioned the usefulness of House Cameron and the system that it had built, now were willing to put the support back towards them. She turned the situation completely around. 3 generations of letting things slide were over with her, and that has to be a 5-point rating. She truly saved the state, or at least her dynasty. If it comes to technology, there was a bit of a slowdown. It was still going on, but there were not so many noticeable impulses here. she gets a 3, which is also necessary because she shifted, as I said, towards civilian research, which is less visible than the military one. But by doing so, she improved the economic situation and the prosperity of her people, who had seen a rapid decline in the living standards in the age of war. I think at least a 4 is here in order. I don't know what your opinion about aggressive peacemaking, pacifism, and such is, but I have to keep in mind that she did everything she could to reduce conflict, and she gave a lot of liberties back to the people. That are good things. In fact, I believe that she is one of the very few people who had good intentions and the ability to follow up on those good intentions. So if it comes to morality, I don't think that we can give her anything else but a full 5 points. Overall, she saved the dynasty. She introduced intelligence wargs and diplomatic ideas back into the power structure of the hegemony, so her importance is quite substantial, and I would give her 4 points here. After such a successful time in office, you would think that someone who follows her policies would be as successful. Yeah, no, not really. We have now Joseph Cameron, oldest son of Deborah Cameron, and he was more than doubling down on aggressive peacemaking. He even went so far, although a former military man himself, that he openly mocked and insulted his military and deeply favored diplomacy and the diplomatic corps. In fact, he completely lacked internal diplomacy, which was just as important than the external diplomacy he so often glamorized. He even went so far to slash the military budget because he believed it useless in his new glorious era of super aggressive peacemaking. This all led to festering discontent among the military, the building of cabals and conspiracies, and finally he paid the ultimate price because he was assassinated. Yeah, so things can happen. I cannot give him a very good rating because he learned the wrong lessons from his mother. By focusing completely and utterly on diplomacy and the diplomatic corps, by neglecting the big stake that the military was, he in fact diminished the power of the Terran hegemony, not increased it like Deborah. So I have given him a 2. He also destroyed the internal cohesion of the realm, which not only led to his death, but to a revolt shortly after. He simply was not able to look into the interests of the different power groups and moderate them, which is a key trait that the successful ruler must have. So again, he got a 2. At least he did no damage towards the economic prosperity and the technological progress. So he gets 3 for both prosperity and tech. And afterwards, I also give him a high morality rating for 4, because avoiding conflict is a noble goal. But sadly, he cannot be called a successful Director General. And that's also reflected in his importance rating. He gets a 1. He was very, very different to his brother. Ladies and gentlemen, we now reached the big one. The last one who can be called a Director General as his main title, and the man who would become the First Lord. Ian Cameron himself. The unifier, the diplomat, politician, and conqueror, first among equals, founder of Star League, and the man behind the periphery war. A man that crushed opposition and reunified mankind. If you allow me this comment, if you look at his action and his skills, and even the pictures of him, it is quite clear that the writers of BattleTech were deeply influenced by Caesar Augustus. You know, the guy who was adopted by Julius Caesar, former Octavian, the first citizen and first emperor of Rome. He was also a very, very cunning politician who was completely and utterly ruthless, just like our Ian. And both of them even looked alike. If you have such a role model to be modeled after, you of course have a stellar rating. By creating the first Star League, Ian Cameron multiplied the power he held in his hand. Everything else than a 5 rating is unrealistic. In technical terms, he took the Terran Hegemony and added the power of the Lion Commonwealth, the Three Worlds League, the Campaign Confederation, the Federated Sons of the Draconis Combine to it. And then he used this power to conquer the periphery. He was the most powerful human being, well, since ever. He was also very, very strong when it came to the internal stability. Yeah, you can now argue that this stability was not so good for the people in the periphery, but if we look at the hegemony, it was outstanding. They know we're the rulers of mankind again, and every opposition was either placated or utterly crushed. Please keep in mind that Ian Cameron was absolutely not afraid to murder his opponents. If we come to technology, there was also a leap. The fallout of the reunification war alone led to a complete new understanding of space warfare, and many ideas influenced the creation of new battle mechs to come. Also, by improving the economic situation, more money could go into research and development. It was not his main focus, so far we have to admit, but tech improved widely under Ian Cameron, so he gets a 4. And I already mentioned it, he overcame all economic troubles of the Terran hegemony by creating the Star League. It was now the production center of all of mankind, and resources and raw goods were transported into the center of the innersphere and here produced into high-quality goods of supreme standard. And this, of course, allowed incredible wealth to flow towards Terra. If it comes to prosperity, he has to get a 5. It was a great big party, and everyone was invited. Those people on Terra for free, those people on the periphery had to pay. But the standards overall were increased. But of course, our beloved Ian has one big flaw. I already mentioned it, and it's pretty much the same flaw Augustus had. Both of them were horrible people. Look at the reunification war, though. You could argue that it was necessary to truly have a unified mankind. But what I have to criticize is the conduct of Terran hegemony, and especially Ian, during the war. He had no problem with keeping the backs free of people like Amos Furlong, who caused mass executions, genocide, and other crimes against mankind. He also had no interest to reduce the scope of the fighting. If you look over the reports of the reunification war, you get the impression that he actually enjoyed spreading the conflict and making it as nasty as possible. Internally, he used executions, draconian punishments, and other things to get people in line. And then he had the goal to present himself as the great benevolent unifier, a man who was full of love for everybody, especially the people he killed. You know, I can stand a mass murderer, but I hate a hypocrite. In fact, I hate the hypocrite so much that I decided to give our beloved Ian a morality rating of 1. I guess the importance rating is something I do not have to explain to you. Do I? He gets a 5. Nothing else would do. The next Cameron was Nicholas Cameron, a far more likable character who had the cozy job of residing over the First Star League during the Golden Age, the rise and time of prosperity and technological progress. The most critical event that is really noteworthy during his time was the Leonard incident. You remember where the coordinator of the Draconis Combine behaved like a complete asshole and murdered a certain guard of the First Lord. Besides that, it was essentially a golden age and a technological boom that Nicholas could enjoy to the fullest. Here we have also the invention of the HBG system, which facilitated communication between the stars. A good time to be alive, for sure. Of course, after the great buildup of power that Ian Cameron conducted, there was here very little to do for Nicholas. So his free is deceptive because while he did nothing new, he had a lot to work with. And the same goes for the stability. The realm was prosperous and stable. Nothing much to improve. Again, as I said, a technological boom, new inventions, both military and even more so civilian, improved the living standard everywhere, so that's at least a 4. And if it comes to prosperity, all sources kind of agree. It was probably the best time of mankind overall. Yes, it even includes the periphery. So, a 5 it is. If it comes to morality, again, we have a man who has no big vices, but also not outstanding virtues. I give him a 3 and hope that he's happy with it. Sadly, being the ruler during the good times also means that there are little problems to face and events to trigger. So, he, after all, is less important than some of the more unsavory predecessors and successors. So I feel a bit sorry, but I have to give him a 2. We don't have to talk too much about him if we describe the history of the First Star League. He was followed by Michael Cameron II. As you see, the House of Cameron was starting to run out of names. He was interesting because he was a bachelor scholar, meaning he liked both ladies and books. An interesting approach that I can understand. But he was also the first man to face some problems in this new and nice Star League. He was confronted by the First Hidden War. Remember the strange Ronin duel campaign started by the Draconis Combine. And he had to start the Gunslinger project to mitigate the problems. During his reign, we also have the Council Edict of 2650 that limited the size of the House armies, a step made necessary by the buildup of the Rimworld Republic, now under House Amaris. But besides that, it was still a golden age and especially a cultural blossom. New ideas, art forms, and fashions were created and influenced mankind as a whole. Again, he kept the ball running. So the power of his realm was magnificent, and he could do very little to improve it. power gets a 3. His realm was prosperous and happy and stable, and why change what works so well? Again, he gets a 3. Sadly, the technological growth started to slow a bit. There were less drive, less interest, and not so many things, although it was still going on, of course. He gets a 3. But of course, the boom continued, the golden age was in full swing. Prosperity, again, gets a 5. And since he was a man who did little right, but even fewer things wrong, he gets a moral 3 points. A fair judgment that is really not offensive to anyone. But again, he suffers from the same fate than Nicholas. If you rule during Golden Age and nothing really great happens, the history books don't need that many pages to describe your times. He gets a 2. But to be fair, he was far better than the next one. We're going now into the last 3 Camerons. And here we have Jonathan Cameron, a man who was mentally unwell, who used huge resources for the space defense system. He had the idea that he could trigger a renaissance of military technology. But during this time, we also had the Second Hidden War, the attempt by the Draconis Combine to swallow the Federated Suns, and he completely failed his duties as a First Lord. Then, this failure and his deteriorating mental stability also caused a conspiracy around General Fredasa, which of course led to the execution of a general. In the last years, he was completely dependent on his sister, Mother Jocasta, and it was more she than him that started Operation Smother, the first military actions undertaken by the forces of a Terran hegemony, so to speak, in ages. And the first time a certain Alexander Kerensky proved his mettle in battle. I would be comparable kind if it came to the power. He weakened the economic and diplomatic influence of the Terran hegemony, but he at least maintained the military power and even increased it a bit, which overall evened the things out. So I gave him a 3 in the power rating. Sadly, his complete failure as a First Lord led to an abysmal deterioration of the internal stability. Not so much if you think about the citizens of Terra or the hegemony, but about the complete Star League. The House Lords started to recognize that they could basically do what they wanted and how they pleased, and that the distant ruler on Terra was no force to be reckoned with. I have to give him a 1. The good thing is, if you waste a lot of money in research projects and interstellar Maginot Line, you indeed improve the technological level of your realm. So, yeah, if we have to give Jonathan Cameron one thing he did well, it was the technological boom in the military space. He gets 4 points here. But this boom came with a cost, and the economy started a downward turn during his reign. He gets a 2 for prosperity. If it then comes to morality, it's kind of difficult to judge. He was, at the end, more or less a madman. He was not motivated by evil thoughts, but he just went off the deep end. I decided to steal myself out of the responsibility and gave him a 3. Overall, he was a crucial part of a Cameron dynasty, sadly more in the bad than the good, so he gets 4 points regarding the importance rating. I also have to mention something else. There's a big question who was at the end responsible for the fall of the Star League. And it's my personal opinion that from all of the First Lords, Jonathan Cameron did more damage to the Star League than everyone else. He simply failed to understand that his position was to mitigate problems between the different House Lords, to have a finger on the scale, so to speak. He was so obsessed with some nightmare-induced paranoia fantasies to hide on Terra behind a special space defense system that he simply failed to stabilize the Star League, which was a purpose he actually had and which his predecessors performed without effort. During his realm, the internal cohesion of the Star League basically vanished. And the House Lords that before that had bowed their heads in submission now started to view it as an annoyance, a hindrance, and something not worthy of obedience or respect. It is the great service of Mother Jocasta that she was at least able to stabilize the train wreck. If she would have refused to stand up, it's quite likely that the Star League would have crumbled during Jonathan reigns and not the one of his grandchild. But before we can reach the last one, we have to tackle the reign of probably the most sad one, Simon Cameron. He was a man of great personal integrity, popular with the people, and quite approachable. During his time, the House Lords got even more aggressive, and the Third Hidden War allowed them across the innersphere to fight each other and to fight the Star League Defense Force. He then decided to use the influence and prestige of his office during a peace tour, and we can all remember that he was at the end killed by a mining robot. Probably one of the most dreadful assassinations in the history of the innersphere. If we have to judge him, we have to say that he did not really change the power of the Star League. It is still a 3. And while he was busy and eager to fix the problems, he was not really able to stop the deterioration of the internal stability. We have to give him a 2 here. Not because there was not enough effort, but simply because he was fighting a deluge, an unstoppable tide. He continued the technological boom, but was smart enough to divert efforts from the space defense system away into more sensible projects. He still gets a 3. If it comes to prosperity, he was unfortunate because he inherited the mess of his father, and it continued its decline with tourism breaking, with trade lanes getting dry, and here again we have a 2. However, the thing we have to praise him for is his morality. He was a man who truly believed that his duty was safeguarding the existing and the prosperity of the people, to maintain the Star League, not because it gave him power, but it allowed mankind to grow, to prosper, and to avoid conflict. He was, after all accounts, a very good guy. And I decided to honor this by giving him a morality rating of 5. Overall, his importance is a bit diminished because he was not able to fulfill the wishes he had. I gave him a 3. If you want to reduce him to a narrative concept, he was the false hope. The man who, if he had a chance, would have been able to turn it all around. But sadly, this chance was cut short by a stupid mining robot. And that's the sad thing about Simon Cameron. And what's also sad is the fate of his son, Richard Cameron II. As with Ian Cameron, Richard was also influenced by a historical figure. Richard II was modeled after Richard II, King of England and last official member of the House of Anjou Plantagenet. And there are more than a few parallels between them. Both became orphans at a very young age. Both were essentially the plaything of the regents and advisors. Both had a very fairy tale-like view on power. Both believed that the authority of the monarch should be absolute and that their subjects were bound to be obedient towards them. Although, to be fair, Richard II of England could act like a medieval monarch because he was a medieval monarch. It was not that he was vile or evil as a tyrant, it was just that he had a different approach to how things should have been handled. And at the end, both Richard paid the same price. They were overthrown by people close to them and murdered. Only the big difference is, Richard II of England was related to the man who killed him, while Richard II Cameron was not. Also, we have to keep in mind that Richard II of England gets a bad reputation because the house that took over from him was the House of Lancaster, which later turned into the House of Tudor and was overly glorified by a certain William Shakespeare, who also made a very non-flattering play about Richard II. But be this as it may, we have to take care of Richard II Cameron. He was, as said, a child emperor raised by heroic fantasies, which led him to get into a consistent conflict with the council lords. Unfortunately, the only friend and father figure that was willing to spend time with him was a certain ruler from the periphery named Stefan Amaris. And we all know how the story ended. Richard was faced with a periphery uprising and decided that it was a good decision to use his own troops to put this uprising down, while Rimworld Republic troops were stationed on Terra. He was a victim of betrayal and murdered by the man he viewed as essentially a surrogate father. It is kind of difficult to be mad at him because, truth be told, he never really had a choice. There was no one willing to really guide him, to protect him or set him right. Stefan Amaris recognized the vulnerability and ruthlessly exploited it. The one who on the paper was responsible to safeguard Richard, a certain General Alexander Kerensky, simply failed to do so and instead preferred to hide away in his SLDF barracks. That's a story for another time. Let us look at the ratings. During his time in office, the power of the Star League clearly declined. The House Lords no longer obeyed the commands. The political games usually were at the expense of the Terran Hegemony and the wider Star League. And of course, there was the periphery uprising, where tons and tons of troops were essentially wasted, exposing the complete hegemony to the Rimworld Republic troop scheme. It was not a complete dismantling. After all, when Richard Cameron was murdered, Alexander Kerensky was able to use the remaining military assets to recapture Terra, but the power of the Star League was diminished. He gets a rating of 2. If it comes to stability, things were even worse. Uprising in the periphery, foreign troops on Terra, House Lords doing what they please. If Stefan Amaris would not have pulled the trigger that dreadful winter morning, the Star League would have crumbled regardless. Richard Cameron simply completely failed to hold it together. Again, not really his fault, because no one ever bothered to give him the tools and the skills to do so. But sadly, he has his name on the chapter of the history books, so he has to take the blame. He gets a 1 for stability. If it comes to technological progress, we can see that it slowed in the last years of Star League. The big ideas and new concepts that even his father still oversaw started to disappear from the pages. A notable decline to the previous decades. He again gets a 2. And also, there was the declining prosperity. With the uprisings in the periphery, the flow of raw material and goods was hampered. And this started to hurt the people everywhere. We have reports of rising unemployment numbers, wide poverty, desperation. It was not enough to truly break the system, but it was certainly not good. Again, he gets a 2. And we cannot even give him a good rating if it comes to morality. He was spoiled and deluded by the things his educators and Stefan Amaris told him. He believed himself infallible and perfect, and at the end created a huge mess. Not because he was bad in his intentions, but simply because he completely failed to have a moral compass. No one taught him about it. I still cannot say that he was completely ruthless and an absolute tyrant like Ian, so 1 would be too much, but I have to give him a 2 because his failings are quite glaring. To give him at least 1 high rating, he was sadly, not by his own action but by the events that unfolded, probably one of the most important rulers of House Cameron, and he gets a 5 when it comes to importance. So, we now went through the complete Cameron dynasty. Let's give a look what we have here. As I introduced, will not use the importance in the overall quality metrics, because internal factors are just too varying and out of control of the ruler themselves. We have high marks for James McKenna, Ian and Jacob Cameron, and of course Richard Cameron II. They all get 5 points, and you kind of have to talk about them if you want to tell the story of the innersphere. Michael Cameron is also quite good, as is Judith. We have, of course, Deborah Cameron, and they get substantial good numbers with 4. So has also Jonathan Cameron, who messed things up. The rest of them are average to low. Not surprisingly, that there are a few highlights and a lot of low level. But now we have the other question: who is the best ruler of House Cameron? Who has the metrics on their side? As should surprise no one, the worst was Richard Cameron II, the man who never had a chance and who finally lost his head, his throne, and the First Star League. He has a total of 9 points. After him, we have Raymond Cameron, the man who was crippled and started to behave like an autocrat, and Theodore Cameron, the party animal that demolished the Alamo. Both are a bit better than him, with 12 points each. The next one is Jonathan Cameron with 13 points. Quite a high rating for the man who essentially put all the events in motion that would, at the end, destroy the Star League. Sometimes you just have to die early enough to save your reputation. He is followed by Richard Cameron, the bastard child of Brian, and Joseph Cameron, the twisted brother of Ian. Both have 14 points because they muddled through so far.
Brian Cameron and Elizabeth Cameron, as well as Simon Cameron, all get 15 points. That is quite interesting because they had 3 very distinct and different rules. Brian Cameron enjoyed the last duel before the Age of War started. Elizabeth Cameron had the complete hands-off approach, and Simon Cameron tried his best and then died from an assassin's hand. At the end, the result of their actions, the events during the reign, leads to 15 points per person. Jacob Cameron now comes with 16 points, a bit better. Margaret Cameron reaches a respectable 17 points, just as Michael Cameron II. They ruled during interesting and good times and had a solid performance. Michael Cameron, as well as Judith Cameron, Nicholas Cameron, they all had 18 points, which is very good. They were clearly capable monarchs and ruled during substantial periods of growth and prosperity. Of course, now we have a benchmark, the man who created it all in the first place, and the only non-Cameron in our list. James McKenna got a respectable and very good 19 points. He was truly one of the most important people in the BattleTech universe. Have you paid attention? Do you know who is still missing? You know, it's always nice to see mother and son working hand in hand, or at least getting the same rating. Even if I have to say the mother was far more likable than the son. But no matter, both Deborah Cameron and also her son Ian Cameron got the prime rating of 20 points. They were, in their own ways, the most effective rulers of the House of Cameron. So, I hope you enjoyed this little rating, and if you have different opinions, if you have new information, if you want to make a comment, you know how you can do that.